In 1836, a British explorer named John Perring was crawling through the damaged interior of an Egyptian pyramid when he noticed something strange. A low, narrow passageway leading off from the burial chamber, choked completely with rubble. He guessed it might lead somewhere, maybe a storage area, but the corridor was packed solid. The pyramid was already badly wrecked by ancient tomb robbers and stone cutters, and he had no way to dig any further. So he wrote down his guess in his notes and moved on to other work. That single guess sat unconfirmed for 187 years. Then, in 2023, a modern archaeological team went back into that same pyramid and found out he had been right the entire time. Here is what they actually discovered, why it took nearly 2 centuries to confirm, and why it genuinely matters for how we understand one of Egypt's most important pyramids. The pyramid in question does not belong to Giza. It is not the one on the postcards, not the one standing beside the Sphinx, not the one surrounded by tour buses and camel rides. It sits at a site called Abusir, a few miles south of Giza, a stretch of weathered desert that most visitors to Egypt drive straight past without ever knowing it is there. Abusir is not famous the way Giza or Saqqara are, but for a stretch of the Old Kingdom, it was the chosen burial ground of pharaohs, and the pyramid at the center of this story belongs to a king named Sahur. Sahur was the second ruler of Egypt's 5th dynasty, reigning a little over a decade around 2450 BCE. His pyramid, when it was first built, stood roughly 47 meters tall, respectable, but nowhere close to the scale of the Great Pyramid at Giza. What made Sahur's monument genuinely remarkable was never its height. It was the artistry poured into it. His mortuary temple and the long causeway connected to it were once covered in more than 10,000 square meters of finely carved relief work, scenes of hunting, ships, gods, and captives, carved with a level of confidence and detail that specialists still study closely today. Some of those reliefs, including scenes of naval expeditions, were unlike anything commonly found elsewhere in Old Kingdom art. If you already know Sahur's name, it is probably because of those carvings, not because of any mystery attached to what lies inside his tomb. To put Sahur in context, he ruled during a period when Egypt was already a confident, established state, sending trading expeditions abroad and commissioning art of real sophistication. His pyramid was the very first one built at Abusir, which meant his architects and builders were essentially setting a template that later 5th dynasty kings would follow. So even a detail as seemingly small as an undiscovered storage wing tells archaeologists something about how deliberately this pyramid was planned from the very beginning, not just assembled block by block, but designed as a complete functioning system meant to serve the king in the afterlife. For a long stretch of modern history, there was not much mystery left to find. The pyramid's interior had been picked apart by robbers and stone cutters in antiquity, so thoroughly that early archaeologists struggled to reconstruct what the original internal layout even looked like. Perring's 1836 survey was really the first serious professional look inside. He managed to clear the entrance and the descending passage, found a single fragment of stone he believed belonged to the king's sarcophagus, and noted a low passageway packed with rubble along the northeastern wall of the burial chamber. He did not attempt to dig it out himself. He simply wrote that it might lead toward a magazine, an ancient storage area, and left the question there for someone else to answer someday. For close to 2 centuries after that, nobody went back to properly test his guess. Excavation at Abusir resumed in the late 1800s and continued steadily through the following decades, and the site drew real scholarly attention. But the pyramid's poor structural condition made a full and precise reconstruction of its internal layout genuinely difficult, even for careful, well-trained researchers. Sahur's pyramid was studied, documented, and generally treated as understood as a badly damaged 4,500-year-old structure could reasonably be. Perring's brief note about a possible hidden passage remained exactly that, a note, unconfirmed, sitting quietly inside the historical record while the field moved on to other questions. That finally changed with a conservation project that began in 2019. An Egyptian-German archaeological mission, led by Egyptologist Dr. Mohammed Ismail Khaled of the Julius Maximilians Universität Würzburg, took on the task of stabilizing and restoring the substructure of Sahur's pyramid. Like most serious conservation work, the goal was never treasure hunting. It was structural. The interior had been slowly deteriorating for thousands of years, with collapsed sections, unstable rubble, and walls at genuine risk of further damage. The team's job, at its core, was to clean out the interior chambers, carefully assess the extent of the damage, and work out how best to protect what remained, with support from the American Research Center in Egypt's Antiquities Endowment Fund. As part of that patient restoration work, the team began carefully clearing away rubble that had accumulated inside the pyramid across thousands of years, including in and around that very same passageway Paring had flagged nearly 2 centuries earlier. And as they cleared it out, section by section, the corridor kept going. It was not simply a dead end packed with waste stone, the way so many blocked passages in ruined pyramids turn out to be. It actually led somewhere. Using a combination of careful hand excavation and modern 3-dimensional digital mapping, the team was able to trace the passage all the way through, and over the course of the project, they identified 8 previously unknown chambers branching off from it, storage rooms that had never once been documented in any prior survey of the pyramid. The rooms themselves are far from pristine. Centuries of high humidity, shifting temperatures, and constant structural stress inside the pyramid had clearly taken a toll on the walls and floors, and parts of the storage area, particularly toward the north and south, are severely deteriorated. But enough of the original walls and flooring survived intact for the team to properly map the space and understand its layout for the very first time in modern history. The chambers were empty when they were finally opened. There were no golden artifacts waiting inside, no sealed sarcophagus, no untouched burial goods stacked along the walls. That absence is not surprising, given how thoroughly the rest of the pyramid had already been looted in antiquity, long before Paring ever set foot inside it. But empty rooms can still be historically significant because of what they reveal about their original intended purpose. Based on their size, their position relative to the burial chamber, and their overall layout, archaeologists believe these 8 chambers were originally built to hold the king's grave goods, the physical objects an old kingdom pharaoh would have been buried with to accompany him into the afterlife. In other words, this was never just an empty gap sitting on an old map. It was a functional part of the pyramid's original architectural design, an entire storage wing that had simply never been recorded because nobody since Paring's brief, rubble-choked glimpse in 1836 had ever actually confirmed that it existed. It is worth pausing on just how long that gap in knowledge actually lasted. From Paring's first glimpse of the blocked passage in 1836 to its final confirmation in 2023 is 187 years, longer than the entire history of powered flight, longer than the existence of photography itself. Generations of archaeologists walked past that same wall, studied the same burial chamber, and worked from maps that simply never accounted for what was sitting a few feet away in the dark. That is not a failure of the discipline. It is simply a reflection of how slowly and carefully real archaeological knowledge tends to accumulate, one careful survey at a time, often across multiple lifetimes. That is what makes this discovery genuinely important, rather than just a passing headline. Sahor's pyramid marked a real turning point in how Egyptian pyramids were designed and built. It broke from several precedents set by the massive 4th Dynasty monuments at Giza, and its temple complex became something of a prototype that later 5th Dynasty kings would go on to follow. Understanding its internal layout more completely, including a storage system historians had no idea was there, genuinely changes how specialists think about the architectural planning that went into it. It is a useful reminder that even a pyramid studied since the 1880s, mapped by generations of professional archaeologists and written about extensively in academic literature for well over a century, can still have real gaps in the record. Not because anyone along the way was careless or sloppy, but because the tools, the funding, and sometimes simply the sheer physical difficulty of clearing away thousands of years of packed rubble by hand were not available yet. There is something almost poetic about how this all played out. Paring did not have modern excavation equipment. He did not have 3-dimensional laser mapping, ground-penetrating radar, or any of the tools that make this kind of confirmation straightforward today. He could not safely clear a passage that was packed solid with ancient debris, not with the resources available to a 19th-century expedition. What he did have was a trained eye and enough intellectual honesty to write down exactly what he suspected, even though he had no way to prove it himself. It took a fully resourced modern conservation mission, one that was working specifically to protect and stabilize the structure rather than to hunt for headline-making discoveries, to finally clear that same passage and confirm that he had been right all along. That, more often than people expect, is how real archaeology actually works. Not a single dramatic cinematic reveal, but slow, patient, unglamorous conservation work that happens, almost as a byproduct, to answer a question somebody first asked nearly 200 years earlier. It is also worth being completely clear about what this discovery is not, because plenty of exaggerated versions of this story have circulated online. These 8 rooms are not painted chambers filled with mysterious, unidentified ritual scenes. There is no evidence of any imagery inside them that contradicts what we already know about Old Kingdom royal burial practice, and nothing that was actually found challenges the accepted timeline of Egyptian religious art or decoration. What the team found is exactly what they themselves describe: a set of storage chambers, badly damaged by time and by ancient looting, that had gone completely undocumented for the entire modern history of Egyptology. That is the real story here, and it is genuinely interesting entirely on its own, without needing anything invented or exaggerated to make it more dramatic. So what happens next? The restoration project at Sahur's pyramid is still ongoing, and the same combination of careful physical clearing and digital mapping that revealed these 8 chambers is exactly the kind of methodical, unglamorous work that tends to keep paying off at sites like this one. Abusir as a whole remains comparatively underexplored next to Giza and Saqqara and Sahur's pyramid, despite nearly a century and a half of dedicated study, has now clearly demonstrated that it still had something meaningful left to reveal. There is no manufactured, sensationalized mystery here waiting to be dressed up for clicks, just a legitimate, well-documented archaeological discovery, and a useful reminder that being fully mapped on paper does not always mean being fully known in reality. If you really think about it, that is the actual hook buried inside this story. Not invented colors that supposedly never faded, and not strange symbols that nobody can explain. Just a 200-year-old guess, written down by one careful man with nothing more than a lamp and a notebook, quietly waiting inside the historical record until the right team, with the right tools and the right patience, finally went back to check. What do you think other pyramids scattered across Abusir might still be hiding, waiting patiently on an old, half-forgotten note in somebody's field journal? Let us know what you think down in the comments, and subscribe for more real, carefully sourced stories from ongoing archaeological digs around the world.